So good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. My name's Anne-Marie Fernandez, and I am a Senior Technical Product Marketing Manager here at ServiceNow, supporting the risk business.
Hi, I'm Drew Whittington. I'm the Global Risk Architect for Solution Consulting in the Risk Business Unit.
All right, so just a couple housekeeping items. As you're joining, I'll be monitoring the Q&A. Try to put the questions in the Q&A, not the chat. That way we can, if we don't get a chance to answer all of them, we can still grab them after the session and we can respond. We can save the questions and respond to them on the community. So this session is recorded and will be shared on the community. All the this presentation and a couple goodies for you are going to be on a community article that I'll throw in the Q&A in just a second. And then at the end of the event, we'll have a little survey that would be really awesome if you could fill that out for us. It's a great way to understand the content and what you liked and any areas that we can improve. All right. Oops. Wrong one. All right. So our quick agenda is we're going to talk a little bit about entities just to level set everyone on entity management. And then answer the question if there's a basis to qualify what should be modeled as entities. Drew, we'll talk about that. And Drew's got some tricks up his sleeve that he's going to talk to you about automating and managing some of the challenges that most folks have with entity management. And then we'll wrap it up with a couple of takeaways for you all. So we've got a quick poll for you all today, which is, and let me get that started. What has been your biggest challenge with entities? And let me launch that now. So folks that are joining, if you could quickly fill that in so we can get an idea of where you're all sitting at. Awesome. Okay, looks like we've got a good amount of the folks answering. And Drew, can you see the poll, how it's looking?
Yeah. I'm looking at it, and I'm intrigued that there's a 0 on retiring entities. That kind of tells me where we are in the life cycle of customers using entities from end to end. It doesn't sound like we've made it to the second end in a lot of cases.
Yeah, well, perfect, because looks like most people are biggest challenges are around identifying entities to create in the first place and relating entities to one another. So that's good news because that's what we're going to be talking about today.
So that's pretty common, team. That those answers are pretty consistent with what we see elsewhere.
Yep, absolutely. So we'll just start with a level set. Quick question is, what is an entity? Even though folks understand it, it's really, trying to simplify it so that folks can better address and implement entity management. So we've got tons of risks in our organizations: risk, data privacy, cloud availability, or workplace safety. And then folks have tons of policies and controls or using monitoring tools to mitigate these risks, or maybe they are implementing these policies and controls in response to regulation. So an entity is really just, where do these apply specifically, right? And so there's a lot of terminology around entities that's pretty new, even for really seasoned risk and compliance and audit professionals. This slide is more of a take home for you guys. I just wanted to highlight that we'll be talking about entities specifically. Entity types is how we generate entities, and then entity classes on the back end, which is used once entities are created. How do we group them for reporting? And then these definitions have it laid out for you in the presentation you can take home. So at the start, this is just a higher maturity model. And so at the start, many folks will take a very tactical approach, and then the end goal eventually is operational resilience. So Drew, while this is a good way of looking at maturity and how folks can implement entity management, how do you see many people end up approaching entity management? Like, what does it end up looking like for many folks?
Yeah. So the majority, I mean, we have to crawl first, right, guys? So the majority of customers that I've worked with are starting at a point where they understand the data quality of the underlying of the applies to records. So for some companies, they have a really tight process inventories. Other companies might have a really tight application inventory. There's usually some level in the hierarchy at which the customer feels comfortable with the data set. And so that's the most common starting point is, depending on what, which, if you go in digital or if you go in business, usually there's a process inventory or usually there's an application inventory. And that becomes the basis that customers will start with, and then they'll build out from there. So you get your starting point, you roll out some risks, you roll out some controls, you figure out life cycles and how you're going to use the solution. And then from there, you can start to build either parents or children based on, some stuff we're going to cover later. I'll save that for those later slides. But just start with the data that a lot, we had a lot of answers that said we're struggling with what to make entities out of in the first place. They are somewhere in your organization. I promise you. Somebody's got a spreadsheet somewhere, or there's a previous system of record, or there's a service management tool out there that folks are using. They're there. Like, your risk and compliance people know what they're protecting with their risk and compliance programs. And that's usually your best place to start when you're trying to populate the entity hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And usually this first part is the hardest because there's so much data, right? There's certain level of processes and services that you may know, but it's all this stuff down below. And so that takes us to the next slide, which is, if we think of operational resilience as the end goal, a lot of folks will use, say, for example, this might look familiar to some folks, use a CSDM to inform where they may be coming from. So all the IT infrastructure, just getting that set of data, using that tactical approach is where we'll be focusing on today. But eventually, as you mature, and the next level is to understand how those support your processes and eventually your critical products. But it's not just IT data, it's customer data, employee data, location data, and supplier data. So these all together will end up creating a resilience program for you. And really being on one platform is, we kind of think of this as, a scalable risk program because all the data is in the one platform so that eventually you can anticipate, prevent, recover, and really understand how you can protect your critical services. All right.
Can you go back to that one? So the comment I have here is that, when you're planning these things out, of course, we're all going to start at some tactical starting point that we know, we've got the known good starting point. What I like to ask customers to think through when they go down this journey is start to think of the questions that you're going to be trying to answer in the future. And then map to answering those questions. Now, those questions are likely going to come from risk staff, compliance staff, executive staff, audit staff. Like, those are the people that you should be consulting when you're setting this up. Because the thing you don't want to do, and I've seen it happen, you don't want to start with a, technologist kind of basic logic. Oh, this seems logical to me. And then you implement something using just kind of common knowledge, horse sense, and you put it in the way you think it needs to be because you did some word association and maybe confuse some definitions.
Yeah.
So don't, as you're putting this in, be working with the appropriate staff, understand the questions that they're interested in, and then build to that. So try to get to a point where you're coming top down, like Anne-Marie's showing you here, as opposed to working bottom up from things like your CMDB or your foundational data.
Absolutely. Good advice, Drew. So ServiceNow risk is almost another language, right? So I feel like risk and entities really go together. You can't just talk about risk, but not say where they apply. And you can't talk about the objects that are at risk without specifically, calling out the types of risk. And so this kind of overlays the CSDM with levels of risk. So approaching things tactically, as IT risk management, or at the operational risk level, or at the enterprise strategic level. So just different ways to align your data with where you want to go. And ultimately, you'll have an end-to-end view. And so entities are really the heart of the IRM data model. When you look at even the architectural level, entities are the center. And no other GRC solution provides the insight or provides this level of granularity. All right, but with great functionality comes great responsibility. And this is getting to the fun stuff now. So Drew, talk about more about the use cases of when entities should be created.
Right. So these are the 4 times when you should be thinking about creating an entity. My tagline here is, don't feel like you have to shoehorn every data element into the entity because somebody mentioned it, that they want to report on it. When you make an entity, it needs to either be the subject of a control, the subject of a risk, or the subject of an audit. If it doesn't meet any 3 of those criteria, you really want to second guess making an entity out of this thing. Location is a very good example of what I'm talking about, where someone will say, well, I need to be able to report on risk by locations. And so they'll automatically try to shoehorn a location entity into the hierarchy to serve that purpose. And that's the one where you may or may not need to make that entity, because that brings us to the 4th step, where I need to aggregate at a certain point. So IRM offers risk roll-up, which is where you're aggregating in a meaningful way the loss expectancies for all the underlying risks. And you can aggregate those all the way up your hierarchy. So you can have a base risk and then have child, parent, grandparent, great-grandparent on up, and aggregate the risk the whole way. Now, if you need to report on risk by location to say how much activity is in a particular geo, you don't really need that to be an entity node, because you can use the reference data. The thing you're protecting has a location. So if it's a person or if it's an asset, it probably has a location somewhere. So don't forget, you can dot walk into that attribution to be able to satisfy a lot of the reporting. Now, contrast that with, I want to be able to aggregate my risk by geo. So let's say I want a total aggregation of my risk scores by county, and then by country, and then by geographical area. Well, in that case, because you're trying to roll up to that level, you'll want to make an entity out of that location. So it's really 2 different use cases. If you just need to report on risk in areas and what's happening and what risks are out there, and that's all dot walking to a location. If you need to aggregate to that location, then you need to think about making that entity node in your hierarchy.
Yep. Good advice. All right. So let's talk about the 2 common challenges we find when folks are getting started with entity management.
Right. So the first one is the question of volume. Um, because we use entities the way we do. So we're saying that if you have a control, you have a risk, you have an audit, we want you to have an entity. That drives a lot of volume into the system. So you end up with a bunch of records that the risk teams may not have been used to handling. So this idea of an entity hierarchy, that's something ServiceNow does, that not a lot of others do. And so your risk business partners may not be used to that concept in managing those records. But there's a lot of automation that we provide to help. So you have to balance things. So you have to automate responsibly, because you run the risk of creating too many entities. And we'll get into a bunch of examples and kind of how to get around it. The second thing I see a lot of is just the general maintenance of the entity hierarchy. So you've got the nodes and you've got the relationships, and managing the life cycle of those records. So again, we're presenting this new data type to an audience of risk and compliance professionals who may not be used to managing records over a life cycle like that. So verifying ownership, verifying relationships, certifying data, that whole thing. There's a lot on the platform that can help, but it doesn't necessarily come set up out of the box. So we need to think through, entity hierarchy. We get it set up on day one. Great. How are we going to keep that data quality up over time? That's where the maintenance of the entity hierarchy comes in.
Awesome. All right. So we've got 2 more slides. And I don't know if you want to go through this and then jump into the demo, Drew? Or...
Yeah, let's do that. We'll go through and kind of tell them what I'm going to show. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the right level of control placement. So making sure that you're creating entities where you need to and assigning controls, and kind of how to automate some of this creation. Using pointers. So that's where the CMD groups and the people groups come in. So is there a way that you can point to a group that has a population and then certify that population? Common controls, which is a newer feature for ServiceNow where entities can share a control. And then we have continuous authorization and monitoring out there, which is another one of these grouping mechanisms where we define a group and then we certify to that group. That's really targeted toward RMF in the Fed space, but that doesn't mean we can't use it in private sector if the use case matches what you're trying to accomplish.
Awesome. All right. And then for maintenance,
for maintenance, this is the forward management of the data set, because you're essentially creating a data model and you want to maintain that data model over time. So using Flow Designer to do some reconciliation, have an example of that. Using data certification, have an example of that. We'll go through decommissioning, and then we'll talk about how to use case management, so compliance case management, which is one of our newer features, as a request mechanism to handle this when you can't automate.
Gotcha. All right, so we're ready to jump into the demo.
Yep, let's do it. Okay, team. All right, we should be looking at, let me know if you can't see this instance, Emery.
Let's see, not yet. I don't see it. All right, my screen is a little, I don't know why I can't see it. Folks, can you guys see Drew's screen?
I might throw it in the chat. Can y'all see Okay, everybody's good. All right, they can see it. Cool. All right, so this is the compliance management workspace, which you're probably all kind of super familiar with by this point. Not going to spend a lot of time here. What I'm going to do is kind of step you through everything that I described in the first couple of slides. So let's talk about entity filters, and let's talk about putting entities controls at the right level. So to help you create entities in the first place, which was, one of the predominant answers to our poll, we provide an entity filter. So this filter is basically a definition of what a particular entity type looks like. So if we're looking at business applications, we might build a filter condition from the business application table to say where it's active. Now, this is an oversimplified one because you can start to build out new criteria to say where it's active and it's internet facing, or where it's active and it's SOX impacted. So you could start to build those filter conditions out to where the system is creating entities correctly because you've got a narrow definition of the entity that you're actually trying to create. So the more specific you can get with this, the more accurate it can be. And also understand that you can be a member of more than one particular entity type. Mm-hmm. Now, as far as getting controls at the right level, what I see a lot of here is you've got customers. So let's take a technology example. Let's take virtual machines. So those virtual servers that are spinning up and down all day long, and they might be here 1 second and gone the next. One of the things that you can do is, instead of trying to create those VMs as particular entities, unless you need to, this is where I go back to consult with your compliance and risk staff. But rather than trying to create an entity for every one of those particular CIs, could we instead use an indicator and monitor all of those for compliance at the population level? So imagine you've got a control against all of your virtual servers, and then there's an indicator on that control where you define a definition to tell it what does a virtual server look like, or whatever we're solving for here. And then let the system monitor that population of records that are popping in and out of existence, to where what you're essentially doing is you're taking a snapshot of the records at the time. You can even define the population, so how many records you're assessing, and you can look for, I call indicators, they look for bad. Basically, you define what the bad condition is in those virtual machines. And ServiceNow will sit there and monitor the entire population for you, and it'll call out when it sees a problem. So that's an example of including every record in your program by way of using an indicator without creating an entity for every single one of those virtual machines. So it's a little bit of a balancing act when you do that. So, for volume, think about it. We created one control for all of our virtual machines. That means there's one control owner. That means there's one attestation. Now, we're still monitoring the entire population, but we're only creating enough of the artifacts that we need to manage it so that we can comply. Contrast that with if we created a control, or if we created an entity for every one of those virtual machines. That's a control for every one of those virtual machines. That's an attestation for that control. So you can see how you can drive a lot of kind of erroneous activity out into the field if you get these initial configurations wrong. Mm-hmm. Same thing on the risk side, where, if you've got, if you've over created entities, let's say, you could be driving out a lot of risk assessments that didn't need to happen, or maybe hadn't happened before. And you can confuse the field that way. So now the business is getting all these risk assessments they've never had before. So that's the thing, create your controls and risks at the right level, ensure you need the entity, and then use indicators for inclusion purposes.
I like that.
Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about to help reduce volume of, controls, attestations, testing, all that, is using a group as the entity. So in this case, I have a CMDB group up here. So this is a tech example where, instead of using the application as the CI in this case, do we want to use a group of applications? Instead of using the application as the entity, Do we instead want to define a group of applications and use that as the entity? So use that group as the thing that we're attesting to, as the thing that we're issuing control tests against, as the thing that we're either compliant or non-compliant, or we're low risk or high risk. And so CMDB offers that functionality out of the box. This is an example of a CMDB group. What you do with these is you can either define it by using the query mechanism. So you can define, there's queries out here. So you've got an actual query builder for the CMDB. You can set up any number of queries here. And then what you can do is include those in the definition of this group. And so this will actually be dynamic. You know, as things spin up and spin down, the population of this will change. This one way to include records. Another way is to just do a saved query from here. So you can build out a query here. And another way is to edit it manually. Sometimes those filters don't catch everything. So typical with ServiceNow, we're going to want you to automate to the extent that you can responsibly. But where you can't automate, we want to give you that manual backstop to where you've got a way out of a pickle if you need it. So this would be one way of defining a group. And you can think of a million other ways. Think of a department, you know, think of, instead of certifying individuals, maybe you're going to certify a department. Maybe the control resides at the department level, so you don't have to put it on individual people, and on, you know, locations, geos, kind of whatever makes sense. And the thing to remember here is we're doing this for a reason. And so work with your risk and compliance staff to be sure that the group you set up is going to answer the question that they're asking for later.
True. So you've got this CMDB group called applications, but they don't have to be all necessarily applications, right? You can get a mix. And so what you're saying is look at the ownership level. You can mix, you know, hybrid classes of entities. Here. Yeah.
And there's a couple of other examples of that later on too. So that's another way to control volume, because we are defining a group and we are certifying the group, and we're allowing that certification to certify the population inside of the group. Another way that we can kind of group things together and get away with fewer controls is to use a common control. So this is on the doc site. This isn't anything internal that I have just for me. The way common controls work is that you have a primary entity and then you have a control. You can turn that control to a common control, and then you can allow reliant entities, so these guys down here, to inherit that actual control. And when they do that, they inherit the status of that control. So if it's compliant, they're compliant. If it's compliant, they are not. I'm sorry. If it's not compliant, they are not compliant. So that's the, you know, in principle, that's what the common control will do for us. And to see what that looks like in the system, this is a control record. And when you want to make a control, so this one's already common. You see, I've got my function here of common control, so I'm not going to do it. But this is, you know, it'll say convert to common in the UI action. And what that does is it gives you these reliant entity and reliant entity type related lists. And so what you can start to do, if you want to do it the kind of the manual way and pull entities in one at a time, you can do it from here, and you're just filtering entities and pulling them in. You can pull it in from an existing control, so you can pick a control and pull the entities in that way. This is the manual way. So, you know, being that this common controls are precise beasts, so I would imagine there's a lot of manual preference here for your risk and business partners. However, if you wanted to automate it, we could use entity types. So we could say that a particular type of entity gets this common control, and then those entities in that type would inherit this control. So a lot of power in this. There's a lot of power where if you set that entity type up right, and you know you can rely on it for this reliant entity on a common control, we've provided you the opportunity to do it. I go back to being responsible and automating responsibly, because you want to be sure it's answering the question that your compliance staff have.
Just quick question on terminology, just because this is newer functionality.
Is newer.
Standard control versus common control.
So standard control does not have the feature of inheritance. Common control does.
Right. So and I think by default, all the controls are standard, right? Until
Correct.
you convert it to common.
That's right.
Awesome.
Okay. Continuous authorization and monitoring. This is another way of doing this grouping that we're talking about. So if you know how Fed and RMF works at all, you have an authorization boundary, and that boundary is essentially your group. All right. So you get to define either by filters, the way we do here, same kind of filter mechanism that I've showed you before. It pulls in the system element. So this defines all of the elements of the system inside of the boundary. So this is your group, and this can be any number of CIs. It doesn't have to just be CI, computers. And then what you do here is you have authorization packages. These packages are your entities. So rather than have entities for all of those CIs that we showed you, you've got a boundary defined, you've got a package, and the package is what you start to pass through. And this is what the package looks like. This is what you start to assess for compliance, right? And so you see my controls are assigned at the package level. My impact assessments are assigned at the package level, and that package references the boundary that I showed you, which defines the population of almost said entities of CIs that we're actually certifying. Okay, so that was that's the volume question. I'm not really watching the Q&A. If you want to call those out to me, okay. So from here, I'm going to go into the automation piece, so the maintenance piece. This first window, if you think about, if you have any ServiceNow experience at all, you know what a CMDB is, and you know the CMDB is a CI table and a relationship table. Like that's the crux of your CMDB. That's the foundational data structure. You've got your nodes and you've got your relationship between those nodes. Entity hierarchy is set up the same way. You've got your entities, which these are your nodes, and this is the relationship between those nodes. So it's the same deal. You've got a parent and a child. Well, we call them upstream and downstream over here. But it's the same deal where you've got a record, and then it's got parents and it's got children, and that's defined in that second table. So if you're familiar with managing the CMDB on ServiceNow, you kind of already know how to apply that logic to this data set on the entity hierarchy side. And a lot of the rules still apply. Now, this will be new to your risk and compliance partners. This is something ServiceNow, this differentiates us. It aligns to, SEC guidance where they start talking about entity-based controls and all that. But what we didn't necessarily do a great job of is informing the risk and compliance business people, so those risk and compliance staff, of how to manage this through a life cycle. Now, luckily, we're ServiceNow, so a lot of that exists on the CI side. And what I've done is I've gone through and I've worked up some examples that I want to show you on how to use platform features to maintain the quality of the data model you've created over time, with as little effort as possible. So the first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is Flow Designer. Now, what I've built out here is an example of using Flow Designer basically to synchronize relationships between an application and its children. This one, that's all this one does. You can, there's some smart folks on the call here. I mean, you could see a lot of application here. You could even build this out more broadly to reconcile all relationships. But just to have something to discuss today, what this is doing is it's basically if a relationship in the entity hierarchy gets updated, it's going to go look at the CMDB for that record. It's going to find it. It's going to start to assess the relationships. That's what my for each loop is doing here. If y'all been on a platform a while, you don't have to do those while loops anymore in business rules. This works really well. And then basically what you're doing is you're going to grab those records. You're going to look for each one and to make sure it's an entity. And then you're going to look to make sure there's a relationship. And if there isn't a relationship, then you'll go ahead and create it. Now, this is just one way of using Flow Designer to keep this data up to date. Something else that occurs to me is, for instance, ownership, entity ownership, control ownership, any one of those things. If an employee goes away, we get asked this all the time. Like if an employee goes away, what happens to those entities? What happens to those risks and controls? And my answer is always Flow Designer. The answer is, what do you want to happen at that point? Because what you can do with Flow Designer is if that record, if that employee record, so if that user record goes to retire or some state we don't want it in, what we can do with Flow Designer is crawl through all of the controls, all of the entities, all of the risks or whatever else, and assign those to maybe that person's manager until the new employee can come in. Or if we know who that replacement is, we can assign it to them. Or if we have a delegate set up, maybe we assign it to the delegate. But Flow Designer is the thing that's going to help you make all those kind of automated data changes behind the scenes in a no-code way that's going to have lots of visibility and that your business partners will be able to understand. One of the things I like about this is that if I'm trying to explain to somebody what I'm doing with this flow, this is human readable. Whereas if I was using a business rule like we used to have to do in the while loops, that doesn't translate as well to non-technical folks. So don't forget about Flow Designer. It's available on the platform, and it can do a lot of this cleanup for you if it's not happening kind of already. Now, the other thing, I mentioned that we have a data model and that we need to ensure the quality of this data model, because think about this, like this is our risk and compliance data. If the underlying data, and when I say underlying data, remember that entities they can be standalone. Let me correct that. So you can have entities that are standalone, but by and large, they're designed to refer to something else on the platform. So let's take that location example. Let's say we make entities out of locations. We're going to look at the foundational location table, create an entity for that, and our entity is going to point to it, or our entity is going to point to an asset, or it's going to point to a process or whatever. Because we're pointing to something, we've now looped that into our model. And because our model is supporting compliance and risk, it becomes really critical that we have certainty in the underlying data. And so there's a feature called data certification on the platform where it does just that, where you can put certification tasks in front of owners and ask them to say, hey, is this still right? Do you still own these entities? Or does this application still refer to these servers, or whatever that question is? Now, again, ideally, you're doing this through some kind of API, through some kind of automation. That's the ideal state. This is a little more manual. We're automating the task creation, and we're giving the user kind of a UI to get through it. But it's still, I consider this the backstop, the manual backstop. But anyway, what you do here is you define a rule set. So the rule set looks like this. This is where you create the certification schedule. You tell it, who do we assign the task to and what do we want to do? And then we define an instance, and that starts to define the definition of what information is presented. But what this starts to do is it'll fire off those tasks to say, hey, Drew, are these all still your entities? Or, hey, Drew, is your entity still related to all of these other entities? And, typical ServiceNow, we're going to give you insight into the process and who's doing it and what the age is and all that business. But data certification is just one of these platform pieces that not everybody remembers or thinks about. So if you're in a situation where you can't automatically verify data, or there's some scope of data that you don't want to automatically do it, but you need eyes on it, every 6 months, annually, whatever. Remember, data certification's out here to help you certify that. And then you've got that audit log to say, yeah, Drew certified, as of December, that these are still his entities and that these relationships are still correct. That's an option out there for you. Now, the last thing I want to cover as far as automation is cleanup, deletion. So, we've talked about creation. We've talked about updating and managing and making sure things are correct. On the other side, so remember, this was the goose egg on the survey. Nobody had trouble retiring entities. Not a lot of people have gotten here yet, but there's some cleanup routines that we provide where, if your entity applies to, so in that example where I create an entity against a process, let's say, if that process retires, ServiceNow will retire the entity as well. There's a cleanup job. So if you go to scheduled jobs, there's a cleanup job in here, and it'll point to some functions and everything, and you can go through that, and you can set the time when you want it to happen and all this kind of stuff. The thing I want to point out here, though, is that the automation that we provide is not going to automatically delete the relationship records. And so whereas we're retiring entities, we're not necessarily retiring the relationships to those entities. That's, it's in the backlog. It's something we're aware of. But it's something that I want you guys aware of, because that creates orphan records. So Flow Designer presents itself as a good solution to this, that maybe when your entity gets retired, you go ahead and mark those relationships as retired. But something to be aware of, that if you get to the point where you're end of life for entities, give that a little bit of extra thought, because we're not doing the whole job for you necessarily out of the box right now. Couple of roadmap items. So for instance, when I showed you this flow where we're reconciling against CIs, that's actually on our roadmap for upcoming release, where we're going to have that feature kind of out of the box. Something we didn't really talk about was making sure that your control owners and risk owners and auditors all have the right access inside of the system. There's some things on the roadmap that'll start to help address that, where, like, if you're the owner of the entity, you would get access to the records related to that entity. So all these things, we're aware of. It's on the roadmap. We're going to get to it. I just want to be as transparent as possible for you, because managing this is something that you really need to think through, because if you know ServiceNow, you know how important the CMDB is, and the entity hierarchy is basically that for risks and controls.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the last piece, so the manual backstop. This is where I end. We have a newer feature. It came out called compliance case management, and what this is meant to represent is kind of the thing that GRC didn't have, or that IRM didn't have until now, was that request record, that incident record, that thing where I have a problem and I want you to help me with it. Where do I go for that? We didn't really have a good way to capture that. A lot of customers were using issue, or using even like catalog item requests for that. Well, now we have it in the system. And so my offer to you is that where you have to interact with the business or with owners, entity owners, over the entity hierarchy, and you can't automate it, well, then go ahead and set up a request mechanism to do that. Because the thing you don't want to happen is for that entity owner or that entity consumer to reach a dead end and then walk away from poorly configured data. Because remember how important it is. Like if you're satisfying some kind of audit, you want that data to be correct. So I encourage you, even if you're not using compliance case to do it, set up that not publicly, but set up that enterprise-wide request item for the field to interact with whoever's maintaining that entity hierarchy when they need help and when they need to make changes.
Mm-hmm. So that's just a great stopgap to fill in where automation can't, necessarily always.
Automation, it can't do everything for us. It can do a lot. But it's going to do what you tell it to do every time. And so I like to have these backstops available so that my people don't feel abandoned, and I can maintain, data quality.
Awesome. So we did have a question.
Okay.
Telmo, sorry we didn't get to it earlier. I believe this was this around indicators or common controls? His question was, with that solution, which I think is common control, but I'm not sure, any indicator that fails will make the control non-compliant, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. All right, so that was it. If you have any other questions, please type them in the Q&A. Otherwise, I think we're doing good on time.
We got a raised hand.
Oh, there it is. I can't see it. You
want to ask your question in the...
There you go. I've unmuted you, Amber, if you wanted to talk. You can unmute yourself and then ask the question live. Oh, maybe it was just a hand up. So, Amer.
Okay, I'll keep going. If you want to put the question in the chat, we'll get to it that way. So key takeaways. The entities are important. Like I said, you can have standalone entities if you're, if you don't have that reference data, but even if you do that, it's still critical to get those entities right. And I would point you to the first webinar we did on this topic around, standing up that governing council, giving, some thought into how you're rolling it out. If you get entities wrong, you could get a bad result when you're trying to prove compliance or risk levels. Try to establish that service-centric roadmap. So where we showed you the maturity curve, and admittedly, everybody's got to start with, that known good, that tactical, you got to start there. But think ahead, understand the questions that senior staff are going to ask so that you can build into that roadmap where you've got the right entities assigned and created and maintained to prove those resilience activities that you're inevitably going to have to do at some point. And then automate responsively. We said that a few times. It's going to do what you tell it to do every time. And you want to be sure of those outcomes. So certainly I take an automation first approach, but it's not necessarily automation always.
Okay, great. So there was a question. When do you recommend the use of entity class rule filters?
Okay, so if you're going to go with entity classes, your entity classes are ways to group entities. I think we covered that in the first one of these. So if you are using entity classes, we do offer filters the same way we offered filters for CUDB inclusion, the same way we offered filters for entity type inclusion. there are class filters that will go ahead and assign those classes using those filters for you. If you've got your classes defined, we didn't really go over that here, but if you have them defined, certainly use those filters, because it's better to automate that part. That's actually a bit safer than entity creation automation, because those classifications will be easier to change later. And you don't have controls on classifications. So that classification, think of it as metadata, think of it as context data for the entities. And if you've got that defined, great, good on you. Go ahead and use those filters to keep those updated.
Gotcha. So you can use the filters. If it's not right where you want it, you can redo them. It's not going to generate more controls,
right,
or anything like that.
Right.
So good question. So there's two more. How can you use business app tied to application service and you're using dev test prod instances to create a single entity?
Okay, business app tied to application service and use dev test prod instances to create a single entity. If we are trying to create an entity for the overall system, so you got a business app and an application service, you might want to start at the application service and then work your way down from there into the underlying bits like the business application and all that. As far as dev test prod, if you're talking about including those environments, so your dev environment, your test environment, and your prod environment as part, as related to that application service, well, then you could create relationships between those CIs. So, the underlying environments to the application service, and then materialize those on the entity side. And then what you would be able to do is roll up compliance and risk to the business service, to the application service, and it would be inclusive of everything underneath it. I think that's the nature of the question. If you're asking around how to, you're not asking about how to promote dev test prod. I'm gonna go with my first answer.
Right. And we're assuming that the control ownership is at the highest level, not necessarily at the entities.
Yeah.
Dev test prod, but those could be tested differently as well. All right. So hope that answered your question. The next one is, do you need to set up parent-child entity classes or just use upstream downstream entity relationships?
You must have upstream downstream entity relationships to inherit risk and compliance scores up and down the hierarchy. The parent-child entity classes, remember, those classes are my metadata. That's context data. So those are optional. Like, the system will work just fine without an entity class. If you're using entity classes to provide that context, then you might very well want to establish those parent-child relationships, especially if you're getting into like the GRC workbench and all that. Then yeah, go ahead and set those up. But everything will work without that. You do need the entity. The relationships between entities are key to making all of the inheritance work.
Right. So the actual generation of the compliance score and ratings is through the relationships. Yeah. The classes won't affect any of that scoring. It's just going to report out the result.
Yeah, the classes will report out results. The classes, like if you're using GRC Workbench, the classes will restrict which children you can assign to which parents. It doesn't, that feature, like that restriction, doesn't necessarily work out in the application. It's just a function of Workbench, which is why I say the class relationships are way less important than the entity relationships.
In creating the compliance scoring. Yeah. Okay, last question is, does the risk assessment methodology rely on classes?
No.
Yeah.
No.
All right. Thanks
I
for
mean,
your
you can,
question.
let me,
Oh,
you
yeah.
can include it, like if you want it to consider class. I think there's a way to include that in the definition of the, what you're trying to assess with that methodology, but it's not required.
Right. So instead of doing it at the class level, it seems like it would make more sense to do it at the entity level, right? Or the risk or control level, like the object that's actually being subject to a risk or control or audit. Um, all right. So I think we are almost out of time. So let's just start to wrap this up. We've got a couple resources for you all to follow up, specifically on entity management, our top 5 community webinars on entities. These are older webinars, but they're still very relevant. And they're not all, some of them are short. So if you need a refresher, please go there. And then our expert services team has a new offering for that can work with your organization. They can work with your organization to do the IRM data model designing. And there is also a link. This is linkable in the slide that's attached to the community article that I sent out. And then another great resource, if you haven't already gone to the Now Learning site, there's the fundamentals. The implementation classes have a lot of the, how to approach requirements around entity management. And so there's the on-demand and instructor-led courses for those as well that are really great. And I think that's it. And next week, if you've got more questions, next week we've got a follow-up, same time next week at 9:00. It's just a short 30-minute, not recorded session, very informal. If you guys want to come in and bring in a couple particular questions, we'll be there to answer them. And here is a link or QR code to look at any future webinars, not just on entity management, but all things risk and compliance. And I believe that is it. And these are just additional resources. Again, the community, our YouTube playlists, and the additional webinar link is there. So we are right on time, Drew. This was awesome. Thanks for all your questions. Thanks, Drew, for all the tips and tricks. And hope you guys have a great holiday.
Yeah. Thanks for coming.